December 8, 1941. The wardroom of the battleship Nagato, flagship of the combined fleet, anchored in Hiroshima Bay. Officers crowded around the wireless room, listening to reports filtering in from Vice Admiral Nagumo's strike force, now steaming eastward from Hawaiian waters. The news was extraordinary. 8 American battleships sunk or damaged, over 300 aircraft destroyed, nearly 2,500 Americans killed. A complete surprise achieved. The officers were jubilant. Some openly wept with joy, others embraced. Sake was broken out despite the early hour. The attack they had practiced for months in secret, the operation so audacious that many had doubted it could succeed, had exceeded their wildest expectations. America's Pacific Fleet lay in ruins at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, but in a corner of the wardroom, away from the celebration, sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, the man who had conceived and championed this attack. His face was drawn, his expression grim. While his officers celebrated the greatest naval victory in Japanese history, Yamamoto sat motionless, staring at the decoded messages spread before him. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. A junior officer, noticing the Admiral's mood, approached hesitantly. "Sir, should we not join the celebration? This is a great victory." Yamamoto looked up slowly. His eyes, colleagues would later recall, held no joy, only a deep, terrible sadness. He said nothing, simply returning his gaze to the reports. Why was the architect of this triumph so troubled? The answer would not become clear for days, even weeks, as Japan celebrated what appeared to be the death blow to American power in the Pacific. But Yamamoto knew something his celebrating officers did not. He understood what they had truly accomplished that morning, and it terrified him. The legend that would emerge from that day, popularized decades later by Hollywood, claimed that Yamamoto uttered a famous warning: "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." The quote is powerful, dramatic, perfect for cinema. There is only one problem. He almost certainly never said it. No diary entry contains it, no letter records it, no witness heard it. But the sentiment, the fear, the understanding of what Japan had just unleashed, that was absolutely real. What Yamamoto actually said and wrote in the days following Pearl Harbor was, in many ways, far more chilling than any Hollywood script could capture. To understand Yamamoto's reaction, we must first understand the man himself. He was, in every sense, a paradox. A Japanese admiral who had lived in America and grown to admire it. A brilliant naval strategist who opposed war with the United States. A patriot who had just executed an attack he believed would doom his nation. Isoroku Yamamoto was born in 1884 in Nagaoka, in Niigata Prefecture. His birth name was actually Isoroku Takano. The name Isoroku meant 56 in Japanese, a reference to his father's age when he was born. He would later be adopted by the Yamamoto family, taking their name. His early life was marked by the rapid transformation of Japan following the Meiji Restoration, the period when Japan raced to modernize and join the ranks of world powers. Yamamoto entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1901, just as Japan was preparing for war with Russia. He graduated in 1904, and in 1905, as a young ensign, he participated in the Battle of Tsushima, one of the most decisive naval victories in history. Japan's fleet under Admiral Togo had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet. For young Japanese officers, Tsushima became the template for naval warfare. Achieve surprise, strike, decisively, destroy the enemy fleet in one climactic battle. But Yamamoto was wounded at Tsushima. He lost 2 fingers on his left hand. The injury marked him physically for life, but more importantly, it gave him credibility. He had shed blood for the emperor. He had proven himself in combat. This credibility would be crucial later, when he advocated positions that contradicted prevailing military opinion. What truly set Yamamoto apart from his peers was his experience in the United States. From 1919 to 1921, he studied at Harvard University. He learned English fluently. He traveled extensively across America, from the east coast to the west, through the industrial heartland. He visited factories in Detroit, saw the oil fields of Texas, watched cargo being loaded at ports in San Francisco, and he understood something fundamental that most Japanese officers did not. America was not just wealthy, it was systematically, industrially, overwhelmingly powerful, in a way that fighting spirit could not overcome. When Yamamoto returned to Japan, he served in various capacities, eventually rising to become a vice admiral and deputy navy minister. In this role, during the 1930s, he fought against the growing military faction that wanted war with the United States. He argued, sometimes forcefully, that Japan could not win such a war. His position made him enemies. Extremist military officers saw him as weak, even traitorous. There were credible assassination threats against him. In 1940, as tensions between Japan and the United States escalated, Yamamoto had a meeting with Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoye. The Prime Minister asked him directly, if war came, could Japan win? Yamamoto's answer was brutally honest. If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild considerably for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second and third years. Think carefully about what he was saying. Japan's top naval commander, speaking to the Prime Minister, was stating explicitly that Japan could not win a prolonged war with America. The best he could promise was 6 months to a year of success. After that, defeat was inevitable. But Konoye and the military faction believed they could force a quick victory. The plan was simple. Strike a devastating blow to American naval power, seize the resource-rich territories of Southeast Asia while America was reeling, then negotiate a peace from a position of strength. America, they believed, lacked the will to fight a long, costly war in the Pacific. Once confronted with the fait accompli of Japanese dominance in Asia, America would accept it. Yamamoto knew this was fantasy. He had lived in America. He understood American character in a way his colleagues did not. He knew that a surprise attack, particularly one that inflicted heavy casualties, would not break American will. It would unite it. But by early 1941, war was inevitable. The Japanese government was committed to its course. The question became, if war must come, how do we give Japan the best possible chance? It was in this context that Yamamoto conceived the Pearl Harbor attack. The plan was audacious, nearly impossible. Japan would send 6 aircraft carriers across 5,000 miles of ocean, maintaining absolute radio silence, to launch a surprise attack on the American Pacific Fleet at its main base. If successful, it would cripple American naval power in the Pacific for months, perhaps over a year. The key word is if. The risks were enormous. American submarines might detect the fleet, reconnaissance aircraft might spot them. The carriers might be at sea when they attacked. Weather could prevent the attack. A dozen things could go wrong. But in April and May of 1941, the British had demonstrated that carrier-based torpedo bombers could successfully attack ships in harbour. At Taranto, Italy, British aircraft had completing severely damaged the Italian fleet. Yamamoto and his planners, particularly Commander Minoru Genda, studied Taranto intensively. If the British could do it with 1 carrier, Japan could do it with 6. Training began in earnest that spring. Pilots practiced on Kagoshima Bay, which resembled Pearl Harbor's layout. Torpedo pilots drilled constantly on low-altitude attacks. They developed special shallow-running torpedoes that could work in Pearl Harbor's 40-foot depths. Horizontal bombers practiced precision strikes. Fighter pilots studied American aircraft types and tactics. The planning was meticulous. Every detail was examined. What time would achieve maximum surprise? What would be the composition of each attack wave? How would targets be prioritized? What weather conditions would provide the best chance of success? By October of 1941, the plan was ready. The Naval General Staff gave final approval. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo was appointed to command the strike force. The Kido Butai, the 1st Air Fleet, would consist of 6 heavy carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. They would be escorted by 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 9 destroyers, and 3 submarines. On November 26, 1941, the strike force departed from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands. They steamed eastward, maintaining absolute radio silence. The northern Pacific route they took was far from normal shipping lanes. The weather was terrible, grey skies, rough seas, perfect concealment. For 11 days, they crossed the Pacific undetected. On the morning of December 7th, they reached their launch position 230 miles north of Oahu. The first wave of 183 aircraft launched at 6 a.m. local time. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida led them toward Pearl Harbor. The second wave of 171 aircraft followed shortly after. At 7:48 a.m., Fuchida transmitted the code, Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. Complete surprise had been achieved. For the next 2 hours, Japanese aircraft tore through American defenses. Torpedo bombers struck Battleship Row with devastating accuracy. Dive bombers hit aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip on airfields. Fighters strafed anything that moved. The battleship USS Arizona exploded when a bomb penetrated her forward magazine. Over 1,100 men died in seconds. The battleship Oklahoma capsized, trapping over 400 men inside. The battleship West Virginia settled to the bottom, her hull torn open by torpedoes. The Nevada tried to make a run for the harbor entrance, but was hit repeatedly and had to beach herself. By 10 a.m., it was over. 8 battleships had been sunk or damaged. 3 light cruisers and 3 destroyers were damaged. 188 aircraft destroyed. 2,403 Americans killed. 1,200 wounded. It was, from a tactical perspective, a devastating success. Back on Nagato, as reports came in throughout December 7th and 8th, Yamamoto's staff celebrated. They had pulled off the impossible. They had struck the Americans a blow that would take months, perhaps years, to recover from. Japan now had free rein in the Pacific and Southeast Asia. The southern operation, the seizure of oil-rich territories, could proceed without interference from American naval power. But Yamamoto did not celebrate. Witnesses recorded that he spent the day after Pearl Harbor sunk in apparent depression. While every other officer in the combined fleet was jubilant, Yamamoto sat alone, reading and rereading the damage reports. Not what they had destroyed, but what they had not. The damage reports told a story that anyone else would have considered a complete triumph. But Yamamoto was reading between the lines, analyzing not just what Nagumo's strike force had accomplished, but what they had failed to accomplish. And the failures, he realized, were potentially catastrophic. The American aircraft carriers were not in port. Enterprise had been delivering marine aircraft to Wake Island. Lexington was ferrying planes to Midway. Saratoga was on the west coast undergoing maintenance. All 3 had escaped. The most valuable targets in the Pacific Fleet, the ships that represented the future of naval warfare, were intact and would soon be hunting Japanese ships. But there was something else, something that troubled Yamamoto even more than the missing carriers. He pulled out a reconnaissance photograph of Pearl Harbor, taken before the attack. His finger traced over a cluster of structures on the eastern side of the base. The fuel oil storage facilities. 45 massive tanks containing 4.5 million barrels of oil. Commander Genda entered the wardroom, still flushed with excitement from the day's success. He found Yamamoto staring at the photograph. Admiral, the men are asking if you will join them in a toast. Yamamoto did not look up. Genda, did any of our aircraft strike these targets? He pointed to the oil tanks. Genda leaned closer. No, sir. The first 2 waves focused on ships and aircraft as planned. The third wave would have targeted support facilities, but Vice Admiral Nagumo decided to withdraw. Yamamoto's expression darkened. And the repair facilities? The dry docks? The submarine base? Also untouched, sir. Admiral Nagumo felt we had achieved our objectives. He was concerned about American counterattack. The fleet withdrew to avoid. He withdrew. Yamamoto's voice was flat. We had complete surprise. We destroyed their battleships. We could have spent another 2 hours methodically destroying everything that makes Pearl Harbor useful as a naval base, and we withdrew. Genda shifted uncomfortably. Sir, the third wave would have faced much stronger anti-aircraft fire. The Americans were fully alert by then. Losses could have been acceptable. Yamamoto stood abruptly. Those losses would have been acceptable, Genda. Do you understand what we failed to do today? We sank their old battleships. Congratulations. But we left them 4.5 million barrels of fuel. We left them repair facilities that will allow them to salvage those battleships we think we destroyed. We left them a submarine base that will send American submarines throughout the Pacific to hunt our merchant fleet. We accomplished nothing strategic. Nothing. This conversation, reconstructed from various accounts by Yamamoto's staff officers, reveals the depth of his frustration. While Tokyo celebrated, Yamamoto was conducting a brutally honest analysis of the attack's limitations. The oil situation was particularly critical. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who would take command of the Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor, later stated, "Had the Japanese destroyed the oil, it would have prolonged the war another 2 years." The fuel stored at Pearl Harbor represented the entire operational capacity of the Pacific Fleet. Without it, American ships would have been forced to withdraw to the west coast, effectively conceding the Central Pacific to Japan. The repair facilities were equally important. The dry docks, machine shops, and trained personnel at Pearl Harbor represented capabilities that simply did not exist anywhere else in the Pacific. With these facilities intact, the Americans could begin salvage operations immediately. Ships that appeared destroyed could be raised, repaired, and returned to service. And that is exactly what happened. Of the 8 battleships hit at Pearl Harbor, only 2 Arizona and Oklahoma were complete losses. West Virginia was raised in May 1942 and returned to service in 1944. California was raised in March 1942 and returned in January 1944. Nevada was repaired and fought throughout the rest of the war. Tennessee and Maryland required only minor repairs. Pennsylvania had been in dry dock during the attack and sustained minimal damage. Within 6 months of the attack, 6 of the 8 battleships were back in action. This was possible only because the repair facilities at Pearl Harbor survived intact. Yamamoto understood this immediately. His staff did not. On December 9th, Yamamoto met with his senior officers to discuss next steps. The minutes of this meeting, captured after the war, reveal a commander trying desperately to make his subordinates understand the strategic situation. "We have won a great tactical victory," he told them. "But we must not confuse tactical success with strategic achievement. The American fleet is damaged, not destroyed. Their industrial capacity is untouched. Their will to fight has not been broken. In fact," he paused, looking around the room, "I fear we have done something very dangerous. We have unified them." This was Yamamoto's greatest fear, and it was being confirmed by intelligence reports, filtering in from neutral countries. American public opinion, which had been deeply divided about entering the war, had shifted overnight. Isolationism had vanished. The attack, particularly the fact that it occurred while Japan and America were technically still at peace, had enraged the American public. The timing was a disaster. Japanese diplomats in Washington had been instructed to deliver a declaration of war 30 minutes before the attack commenced, but delays in decoding and translating the lengthy message meant it was not delivered until after the attack had begun. From the American perspective, this was not an attack. It was a sneak attack, a stab in the back while diplomats were still negotiating. Yamamoto was furious about this failure. One officer recorded him saying, "A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame. Simply, for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that, angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack." This quote, from a reply to journalist Ogata Taketora on January 9, 1942, captures Yamamoto's actual sentiment far better than the mythical sleeping giant quote. He was not prophesying doom in dramatic terms. He was conducting a sober analysis of cause and effect, Japan had attacked America while claiming to negotiate peace. America would respond with fury. That fury would be translated into industrial mobilization and military action. Japan had perhaps a year before that response became overwhelming. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The reports from America confirmed Yamamoto's fears. On December 8th, President Franklin Roosevelt addressed Congress. His speech was brief, direct, and devastating in its simplicity. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. The vote was nearly unanimous, only one dissenting vote in the House of Representatives. Public opinion polls conducted in the days after Pearl Harbor showed 97% support for the war declaration. Young men flooded recruitment offices. Factories began converting to war production. The American industrial machine, the very thing Yamamoto feared most, was waking up. And then, on December 11th, Adolf Hitler made a catastrophic error. Germany declared war on the United States. Hitler was not required to do so under the tripartite pact. That alliance called for mutual defense only if a member was attacked, not if a member initiated hostilities. But Hitler, convinced that Germany would defeat the Soviet Union before American industrial power could be brought to bear, declared war anyway. This meant that America, which might have focused exclusively on Japan, would now fight a two-front war. But it also meant that American industrial capacity would be fully mobilized. The Germany First strategy that American war planners adopted meant that the Pacific would be a secondary theater, but it would still receive resources that dwarfed anything Japan could produce. Yamamoto knew the numbers. He had studied them carefully. In 1941, American steel production was approximately 8 times that of Japan. American oil production was roughly 100 times greater. American shipbuilding capacity was perhaps 15 to 20 times larger. American aircraft production would soon exceed Japan's by a factor of 10 to 1. These were not abstract statistics to Yamamoto. They were the concrete reality that would determine the war's outcome. He tried to explain this to his staff, to the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, to anyone who would listen. Most did not want to hear it. They were intoxicated by victory, convinced that Japanese fighting spirit would overcome American material advantages. But there were others who understood. Admiral Chuichi Hara, who would fight throughout the war, later summarized the situation perfectly. "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor and thereby lost the war." In the weeks following Pearl Harbor, as Japan's armies swept across Southeast Asia, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Yamamoto was already planning for the inevitable American counteroffensive. He understood that Japan had perhaps 6 months of relatively free operations before American strength would begin to tell. He focused on a plan to draw out and destroy the American carriers, particularly Enterprise and Lexington, which had escaped Pearl Harbor. If he could sink those carriers, Japan might buy another 6 months. The plan would culminate in an operation to seize Midway Island, forcing the Americans to commit their carriers to a decisive battle. But even as he planned this operation, Yamamoto was under no illusions about Japan's long-term prospects. In private conversations with his staff officers, recorded in their diaries and memoirs, he repeatedly returned to the same themes. Time was against Japan. American industrial power was awakening. The window for Japanese operations was closing rapidly. One staff officer, Captain Yasushi Watanabe, recorded a conversation from late December 1941. Yamamoto had been studying intelligence reports about American mobilization. Factories were converting to war production. Shipyards were expanding. Training camps were being established. The scale of the mobilization was staggering. "They are doing exactly what I knew they would do," Yamamoto said. "They are turning their entire nation into a war machine. Every factory, every shipyard, every resource is being directed toward one goal, our destruction. And we cannot match them. It is not a question of courage or skill. It is mathematics. Watanabe asked if there was any path to victory. Yamamoto's response was chilling. We would have to destroy their will to continue. We would have to inflict such costs, such casualties, that the American people would demand peace. But I do not think this is possible. I have lived among them. I understand them. They will not quit. They will fight until we are completely defeated, no matter how long it takes. This was the terrible knowledge that tormented Yamamoto in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor. He understood, with absolute clarity, that Japan had embarked on a war it could not win. The attack he had planned and executed had not altered this fundamental reality. If anything, it had made Japan's position worse by unifying American opinion and providing moral justification for total war. The contrast between Yamamoto's understanding and the prevailing mood in Japan was stark. The Japanese press trumpeted the Pearl Harbor attack as the greatest naval victory in history. Newsreels showed cheering crowds, triumphant military parades, celebrations of Japanese superiority. The public was told that America had been dealt a knockout blow, that the soft, materialistic Americans would soon beg for peace. Yamamoto knew this was fantasy. He read the intelligence reports from America. He saw the photographs of recruitment lines stretching around city blocks. He received updates on American industrial mobilization. He understood what was coming. In his cabin aboard Nagato, late at night when the celebrating had finally died down, Yamamoto would sit alone with his thoughts. His personal steward, who survived the war and was interviewed decades later, described finding the Admiral at his desk at 3 a.m., surrounded by reports and charts. He was not sleeping, the steward recalled. He was calculating, always calculating, how much time we had, how many ships we could build, how many the Americans could build. I do not think the numbers ever brought him comfort. There was one report that particularly troubled Yamamoto. American intelligence, intercepted and decoded, revealed that President Roosevelt had called for the production of 60,000 aircraft in 1942 alone, and 125,000 in 1943. These numbers seemed impossible. Japan's entire aircraft production capacity for 1942 was projected at 5,000 planes. Yamamoto showed the intercept to Captain Kuroshima, his chief operations officer. Do you think these numbers are real? Or is this propaganda to frighten us? Kuroshima studied the document. Sir, American industrial capacity is substantial, but these numbers seem exaggerated. 60,000 aircraft in 1 year? It cannot be done. Yamamoto shook his head. I have seen their automobile factories. I have seen their assembly lines. If they are reporting these numbers, they believe they can achieve them. And if they believe it, we must assume they will. He was right to be concerned. By the end of 1942, America produced 48,000 aircraft. By the end of 1943, 86,000. The numbers, if anything, proved to be conservative estimates. American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, exceeded even what American planners had thought possible. But there was something else troubling Yamamoto, something perhaps more fundamental than industrial statistics or strategic calculations. It was the moral dimension of what Japan had done. Yamamoto had opposed war with America precisely because he believed Japan would lose. But he had also opposed it because he respected America, admired much about American society, and did not want to see the two nations destroy each other. Now, Japan had launched a surprise attack that killed thousands of Americans. America would respond with overwhelming force. Young Japanese men, boys, really, many of them barely 20 years old, would die in vast numbers, fighting a war they could not win. Japanese cities would burn. Japanese civilians would starve. All of this was foreseeable. All of this was, in Yamamoto's view, avoidable. And yet, despite his misgivings, despite his understanding of what was to come, Yamamoto remained a loyal Japanese officer. He would plan operations, command fleets, and do everything in his power to give Japan the best chance possible. But he would do so without illusions, without the intoxicating optimism that gripped most of his colleagues. In January of 1942, Yamamoto received a letter from a friend asking him to assess Japan's chances. His response, captured in the letter that survives in Japanese naval archives, was brutally honest. Britain and America may have underestimated Japan somewhat, but from their point of view, it's like having one's hand bitten rather badly by a dog one was feeding. It seems that America, in particular, is determined before long to embark on full-scale operations against Japan. He was describing precisely what Roosevelt had called for in his speech to Congress: not a limited war, not a negotiated settlement, but full-scale operations until Japan's unconditional surrender. The very concept was alien to Japanese military thinking. Wars were supposed to end with negotiated settlements after decisive battles, but America was preparing for something different. Total war, fought with total commitment, until the enemy was completely defeated. The first sign that Yamamoto's fears were justified came in April of 1942. On April 18th, 16 American B-25 bombers, launched from the carrier Hornet, struck Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The Doolittle raid, as it became known, did minimal physical damage, but the psychological impact was profound. Japan, the invincible conqueror of Asia, had been struck in its homeland. The emperor himself had been put at risk. The military leadership, which had promised the Japanese people they were safe, had been humiliated. The attack accomplished exactly what its planners intended. It demonstrated American resolve and damaged Japanese morale. For Yamamoto, the Doolittle raid was confirmation of what he had been saying all along: America would fight back. America would take the war to Japan's doorstep. The only question was how quickly American power would build. On June 4th, American dive bombers struck 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, in the span of 5 minutes. All 3 were left burning and would sink. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, was destroyed later that day. Japan lost 4 of the 6 carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, along with hundreds of irreplaceable aircrew. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. Everything Yamamoto had predicted came true. Japan had run wild for 6 months. After that, as he had warned, the situation changed dramatically. America's industrial power began to manifest. New carriers appeared. New aircraft filled the skies. American submarines, operating from the Pearl Harbor base that should have been destroyed, began systematically hunting Japanese merchant shipping. Yamamoto survived Midway but understood its implications. Japan had lost the strategic initiative. From this point forward, Japan would be reacting to American moves, not dictating the pace of operations. The window for Japanese offensive operations had closed permanently. In the months after Midway, Yamamoto's earlier predictions continued to materialize with terrible accuracy. American shipyards began launching new Essex-class carriers at an impossible pace. American factories delivered thousands of new aircraft monthly. American forces seized Guadalcanal, establishing a foothold in the Solomon Islands. Each intelligence report confirmed what Yamamoto had known since December 8, 1941. Japan was fighting a war of attrition against an enemy with 10 times its industrial capacity. The mathematics were inexorable. Every Japanese ship sunk could not be replaced. Every American ship sunk was replaced by 3 more. By early 1943, the disparity was becoming obvious even to officers who had dismissed Yamamoto's warnings. Japanese pilots, the elite aviators who had struck Pearl Harbor, were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Training programs could not keep pace with losses. Meanwhile, American pilots arrived at the front with hundreds of hours of training, flying aircraft superior to anything Japan could produce. Yamamoto received reports from frontline commanders describing the changing nature of the air war. In 1942, Japanese Zero fighters had dominated aerial combat. By mid-1943, American Hellcat fighters were achieving kill ratios of 19-1. The advantage had shifted completely. But Yamamoto would not live to see Japan's final defeat. On April 18, 1943, exactly 1 year after the Doolittle raid, American codebreakers decrypted a message detailing Yamamoto's inspection tour of the Solomon Islands. The message included his exact schedule, flight path, and aircraft type. Admiral Nimitz faced a decision. They could ambush and kill Japan's most capable naval commander, but doing so would reveal that American intelligence had broken Japanese codes. After consultation with Washington, the decision was made. The strategic value of eliminating Yamamoto outweighed the risk of compromising code-breaking operations. On the morning of April 18th, 18 P-38 Lightning fighters intercepted Yamamoto's transport aircraft over Bougainville. In a brief, violent engagement, both Japanese aircraft were shot down. Yamamoto's plane crashed in the jungle. He was found still strapped in his seat, killed instantly by machine gun fire. The man who had warned Japan not to attack America, who had planned Pearl Harbor while predicting it would lead to defeat, who had understood from the beginning that Japan could not win a prolonged war, was dead. He never lived to see the firebombing of Tokyo, the atomic bombs, or Japan's surrender. Perhaps that was a mercy. But in his cabin, after his death, officers found his personal papers. Among them were letters, diary entries, and strategic assessments that painted a picture of a man who understood exactly what Japan had done on December 7th, 1941. They had won a tactical victory and guaranteed a strategic defeat. One document, a letter to a fellow admiral written in February of 1943, summarized Yamamoto's view. "We succeeded in our surprise attack, but we failed in our objective. We aimed to cripple American naval power for 2 years, long enough to secure our conquests and force a negotiated peace. Instead, we unified our enemy, provided them with moral justification for total war, and left intact the facilities that allowed them to recover in 6 months. We won the battle and lost the war." This assessment, found decades later in Japanese naval archives, represents Yamamoto's final judgment on Pearl Harbor. It was not the dramatic sleeping giant quote of cinema, but it was far more damning. It was a professional military officer's sober analysis of a strategic blunder, because that is what Pearl Harbor ultimately was, a brilliant tactical operation that achieved all its immediate objectives while failing completely in its strategic goals. The attack was supposed to buy Japan time. It bought 6 months. It was supposed to break American will. It unified American resolve. It was supposed to cripple American naval capability. It left American carriers untouched and American support infrastructure intact. The tragedy is that he was right about everything. Japan did run wild for 6 months. The Battle of Midway did occur exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. American industrial mobilization did exceed even pessimistic Japanese estimates. America did fight a total war until Japan's unconditional surrender. Every prediction Yamamoto made came true. And yet Japan fought on for 3.5 years after Yamamoto's death. They fought, knowing they could not win, sacrificing millions of lives for a cause that had been lost at the moment of Pearl Harbor's success. This was the ultimate irony. The attack that was supposed to secure Japan's position in Asia instead guaranteed Japan's destruction. The officers who celebrated in Nagato's wardroom on December 8, 1941, could not see this. They saw burning American battleships and assumed victory. Only Yamamoto, sitting alone in apparent depression, understood what they had actually accomplished. They had started a war they could not win against an enemy that would not quit by attacking in a way that unified that enemy's resolve. In the decades after the war, as historians sifted through Japanese archives and interviewed surviving officers, Yamamoto's story emerged as one of the great tragedies of World War II. Here was a man who understood the strategic situation perfectly, who warned repeatedly against war with America, who was ignored by political and military leaders convinced of their own superiority. And when war became inevitable, he planned and executed the attack that made everything worse. Pearl Harbor, intended to secure Japan's position, instead guaranteed Japan's defeat by awakening American power and resolve. The tactical success of December 7th led directly to the strategic catastrophe of August 1945. The real story of Yamamoto after Pearl Harbor is not about a dramatic quote that may never have been spoken. It is about a brilliant strategist forced to execute a plan he knew was futile, watching his predictions come true one by one, knowing that every Japanese victory was merely postponing an inevitable defeat. When his staff celebrated on December 8th, Yamamoto sat in depression because he could see the future clearly. In 6 months, Midway. In a year, Guadalcanal. In 2 years, American forces island hopping across the Pacific. In 3 years, the Philippines. In 4 years, Okinawa. And finally, the firebombing of Japanese cities and atomic weapons that would force surrender. All of this was foreseeable on December 8, 1941, not in specific detail, but in general outline. Yamamoto saw it because he understood America in a way his colleagues did not. He had lived there. He had studied there. He knew that America, once committed to war, would fight with overwhelming force until victory was complete. The lesson of Yamamoto's story transcends World War II. It speaks to the danger of confusing tactical success with strategic wisdom. Pearl Harbor was tactically brilliant, a masterpiece of planning, execution, and surprise. But it was strategically disastrous, transforming American opinion overnight and providing moral justification for total war. Modern military professionals study Pearl Harbor not as an example of how to conduct a surprise attack, but as an example of how tactical success can mask strategic failure. You can sink 8 battleships and still lose the war. You can achieve complete surprise and still guarantee your own defeat. You can win the battle decisively and still awaken a force that will ultimately destroy you. This was Yamamoto's burden after December 7th. He knew all of this. He had predicted all of this. And now he had to watch it unfold, exactly as he had foreseen, knowing that nothing could change the outcome. The celebrations in Tokyo, the triumphant newsreels, the proclamations of Japanese invincibility, all of it must have seemed hollow to Yamamoto. He was living in a different reality than his celebrating countrymen. They saw victory. He saw the beginning of the end. And in the quiet of his cabin aboard Nagato, as his officers toasted their great victory, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto understood that Japan had just made the greatest strategic blunder of the war. Not because the attack failed, it succeeded brilliantly, but because it succeeded in all the wrong ways, accomplishing tactical objectives while guaranteeing strategic defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.